When the humble son of a maid shocks everyone by speaking in sign language to the millionaire's mother, an apparently innocent gesture awakens buried secrets, confronts powerful lies, and sparks a battle between arrogance and truth, proving that even the smallest can change the fate of an empire. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel now to receive powerful stories every day that touch the heart. That night, the Montero mansion looked more like a modern palace than a simple residence. Crystal chandeliers reflected golden light over impeccably set tables where businessmen, politicians, and socialites laughed between glasses of wine and calculated glances. The orchestra filled the air with soft notes, but behind the music lingered an atmosphere of power and competition. Waiters hurried by, balancing trays that clinked with silverware, while Heir Eduardo Montero paraded among the guests with the confidence of someone who believed he controlled not only the family's fortune, but also every detail of the environment. For everyone else, it was just another night of ostentation. For Gabriel, however, something was about to change forever. Among the guests, seated alone near the center of the hall, was Helena Montero, the millionaire's mother. Her gray hair was tied back in an elegant bun, and her dark blue gown carried the dignity of a woman who had once been admired. But now, deaf and often ignored even by her own children, Helena seemed more like a piece of decoration, present, yet invisible. Gabriel, the son of the maid Maria, watched from a distance. Only 13 years old, but his eyes reflected a quiet courage. He carried a heavy tray, yet couldn't take his eyes off the lady who gestured discreetly with her hands, as if seeking a connection no one cared to offer. Then, with his heart racing, Gabriel set the tray down on the nearest table and walked across the hall. Each step echoed among the laughter of the guests. When he stopped in front of Helena, he raised his trembling hands and signed, "Good evening, Mrs. Helena." The entire hall fell silent, as if time itself had stopped. The guests' suspended breaths blended with the faint ringing of crystal from the chandeliers. And as Helena smiled through tears, recognizing in that gesture something deeply personal, all eyes turned in shock to the boy who had dared to break invisible barriers. At that moment, no one could imagine that such a simple greeting would unlock secrets powerful enough to change the fate of the Montero family. The Montero mansion's grand hall seemed to breathe luxury in every detail. The walls were adorned with masterpieces by renowned artists, purchased at international auctions and strategically placed to impress the guests. Dark oak tables reflected the glow of candlelight, and crystal goblets gleamed like tiny suns beneath the golden light. It was more than a party. It was a spectacle of power carefully orchestrated to reaffirm that the Monteros were still the most influential family in the city. Whispered conversations about billion-dollar deals mixed with rehearsed laughter, while everyone pretended spontaneity in an environment where every gesture was calculated. Maria, as discreet as always, moved between the tables with a humble posture, balancing trays of expensive dishes she would never have the chance to taste. Her gaze, however, never left her son. She knew Gabriel should not be there, surrounded by so many heavy stares, but she also saw something in his eyes, a mixture of fear and determination that unsettled her. A mother's heart warned her that something was about to happen, yet bound by her duty to serve, she had no choice but to watch from afar. Meanwhile, Eduardo, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, moved through the hall like the host of an empire, greeting dignitaries and flashing calculated smiles, unaware that the order he so valued was on the verge of being shattered. Helena, on the other hand, though surrounded by such extravagance, seemed to inhabit another world. Her fingers moved slowly, shaping words in silence that no one cared enough to understand. It was as if she were conversing with memories of the past, ignored by the very elite gathered around her. But Gabriel understood. Each movement felt familiar to him, like a forgotten code he had secretly learned. And when their eyes met, an invisible bridge formed between them, a bridge that could either illuminate long-buried truths or plunge them all into deeper darkness. Gabriel was only 13, yet there was a maturity in his eyes that contrasted with his age. His brown hair was tousled, his skin lightly sun-kissed, and his hands bore the marks of the simple work he did to help his mother at home. He wore the plain uniform of the servants, but even among the expensive suits and glittering gowns, there was a firmness in his stance. He was not just Maria's son. He was a boy who observed every detail with sharp attention, silently absorbing the world that had always been denied to him. His heart pounded faster than the rhythm of the orchestra, yet his steps never faltered. Maria, his mother, was a 40-year-old woman whose tired expression was offset by her strength. Her hair was pulled back in a simple bun, her blue uniform crisp, and her gaze constantly torn between her duties and her son. A widow for many years, she had devoted her life to raising Gabriel, even if it meant serving a family that never saw her as anything more than an employee. That night, every movement of hers reflected both pride and apprehension, as if she sensed that something was about to slip out of control. Her greatest hope and deepest fear stood before her eyes. Her own son, on the verge of standing out where everyone expected him to remain invisible. And then there was Helena Montero, the 72-year-old matriarch of the family. Despite the deafness that isolated her from so many conversations, she carried a dignity that defied the indifference around her. Her face was marked by time, but her eyes held profound stories. At her side moved Eduardo, her 45-year-old son and heir, the embodiment of arrogance and power, every gesture carefully designed to impress. Never far behind was Dr. Bittencourt, the 55-year-old lawyer with a cold gaze and soft voice, known for solving problems before they could become scandals. And discreetly watching everything was Isabel, the 38-year-old director of the Montero Foundation, whose elegant posture masked the unease of someone who sensed cracks in the family's perfect facade. Each of them, with their strengths and flaws, formed a chessboard on which Gabriel's simple gesture had just moved the first piece. The hall buzzed with laughter and conversation until the sudden clatter of silverware falling silenced the room. Gabriel had stopped in front of Helena. The guests, accustomed to seeing him only serving tables, frowned in disbelief as the boy dared to cross the invisible line between servants and the masters of the party. Eduardo, watching from a distance, narrowed his eyes in suspicion, unaware of the force about to unfold. Helena, weary and lost amid the evening's glitter, finally noticed the unexpected presence of the frail boy standing before her. Gabriel took a deep breath. His hands trembled, but his memory did not fail him. Slowly, he raised his fingers and signed, "Good evening, Mrs. Helena." The words were not spoken aloud, yet they echoed through the hall as if thunder had cracked the crystal ceiling. For a few seconds, no one knew how to react. The guests' silence mingled with the flicker of candlelight, and curious eyes tried to decipher what was happening. But Helena suddenly brought her hands to her face, astonished. A genuine smile spread across her lips, and discreet tears shimmered in her eyes. With delicate gestures, she responded, not merely with a greeting, but with a sign of profound meaning, an intimate gesture she had once shared only with another person in another time. The guests exchanged confused glances, unable to grasp the meaning of those hands. To them, it was nothing more than a mysterious dialogue, but to Helena it was as if she had found a lost piece of herself. Eduardo narrowed his eyes, irritated at the attention being drawn away from him. Maria placed a hand over her chest, unsure whether to rush to her son or weep at the sight. Isabel observed intently, sensing that this small act concealed something far greater. And in Gabriel's heart, a flame ignited. He had touched something that went beyond a simple greeting. He had awakened a long-buried truth no one in that hall wished to see revealed. The heavy silence hanging over the room was broken by the sharp scrape of a chair. Eduardo Montero, in his perfectly tailored Italian suit, rose with the authority of a general before his soldiers. His cold, piercing eyes scanned the hall until they locked onto Gabriel. The boy still stood before Helena, his hands lowered but his gaze steady. To Eduardo, that gesture was more than boldness. It was a public insult. His jaw tightened, and with firm steps that echoed across the marble floor, he strode through the hall, the guests instinctively parting in silence to let him pass. Helena still smiled, touched by the unexpected dialogue in signs, but her expression shifted as she noticed her son's approach. Eduardo stopped directly in front of Gabriel, the stark contrast of height and social status emphasizing the cruel divide between their worlds. He leaned slightly forward, his voice low but sharp as steel. "Where did you learn that, boy?" The question was not mere curiosity. It was an accusation in disguise. The entire hall held its breath, watching the scene unfold like a spectacle, and no one dared intervene. From across the room, Maria felt her legs tremble. Her maternal instinct screamed to protect her son, but she knew any sudden move could cost them dearly. Gabriel inhaled deeply, struggling to contain the fear burning in his chest. He could lie, invent some excuse, but something in his heart told him the truth was the only way forward. Before he could answer, however, Helena gently touched her son's arm, signaling something only he could understand. Impatient, Eduardo raised his voice so that all could hear. "Answer me. How does a maid's son dare to know something that belongs to my family?" His words echoed through the hall, carrying not only arrogance but the promise that nothing would ever be the same after that night. Gabriel felt the weight of every gaze upon him, as though each guest were a silent judge awaiting his misstep. His hand still shook, but he did not look away from Eduardo. In a low yet firm voice, he declared that he had learned those signs from old videos he had found in the forgotten archives of the Montero Foundation. The answer struck the hall like a stone dropped into still water. Heavy, unexpected, impossible to ignore. Some guests frowned, others whispered to one another, and Isabel, attentive from a corner, raised her eyebrows as if confirming a suspicion she had carried for a long time. Eduardo tried to mask his surprise, but the tension in his face betrayed his unease. He knew those files should never have been accessed, least of all by a boy who did not even belong to the elite. Helena, however, kept her gentle smile, and discreet tears ran down her face as she remembered when she had first taught that sign to her late husband. For her, it was a reunion with the memory of love, but for Eduardo it was a real threat. If Gabriel had seen more than he should, he could unearth secrets strong enough to shatter his prestige. From the back of the room, Maria raised her hands to her mouth as if to hold back the pounding of her heart. The hall remained in silence, everyone waiting for the next word. Eduardo stepped closer to the boy, his shadow nearly engulfing Gabriel, and with an icy tone he whispered that he must never repeat those gestures in front of anyone again. But before he could push the boy away, Helena touched Gabriel's arm once more and signed a single word, a word only he understood, one that drained the color from his face. A chill ran down his spine, for he realized it wasn't just a family memory, it was a code. A code that, if revealed, could expose something far greater than simple recollections. As the orchestra music returned to fill the air, the guests pretended to resume their conversations, but everyone knew the atmosphere had shifted. Eduardo, restraining the impulse to create a greater scandal, stepped back and discreetly signaled to the family lawyer. Dr. Bittencourt, his expression impassive and his steps deliberate, approached Maria as she tried to steady herself with the trays. His voice was low but venomous. "If your son continues with this insolence, neither of you will have a place in this house. And I'm not only talking about your job, but about the dignity you still cling to." Maria shuddered, each word cutting into her like a blade. She tried to argue, saying Gabriel had done nothing wrong, that he had only greeted Helena with respect. But the lawyer, wearing a cold smile, cut her down mercilessly. "Too much respect is dangerous, Mrs. Maria. Sometimes it raises questions that were never meant to be answered." His eyes drilled into her, as if branding fear into her very soul. Maria swallowed hard, struggling to remain upright, though inside she felt as if she might collapse at any moment. The weight of that threat was heavier than any burden she had carried before. Meanwhile, Gabriel watched from afar, unable to hear the conversation, but reading his mother's expression and sensing something terrible was happening. He wanted to run to her, but he stood frozen, caught between the courage that had carried him across the hall and the fear of triggering something far worse. Isabel, who also noticed the tension, moved closer discreetly, her eyes meeting Maria's with a silent promise of support. But Bittencourt's threat had already left deep scars. Maria knew the night would not end without consequences, and in her heart she feared her son's innocent gesture had opened the door to a dangerous labyrinth of secrets and lies. Between toasts, while Eduardo flashed forced smiles to maintain appearances, Isabel quietly slipped away from the group of influential guests and headed toward a side corridor of the mansion. Maria, still shaken by Bittencourt's threat, seized the chance to follow the director, who seemed to be waiting for her. Away from prying eyes, Isabel opened a slim folder she carried under her arm and showed Maria an old photograph, yellowed with age. In it, Helena and her late husband stood at a foundation event, smiling for the cameras. But the most important detail wasn't their faces, it was their hands, clasped together, forming the exact same sign Gabriel had repeated minutes earlier. Maria raised her hand to her mouth, stunned. "So that gesture wasn't just an intimate greeting?" she whispered. Isabel nodded, explaining that the sign represented the original motto of the foundation, honesty above all. For her, Gabriel hadn't just recalled a random memory, but revived the symbol of a pact upon which the entire Montero empire had been built. A pact that, over the years, had been forgotten or deliberately erased. Maria felt a mixture of pride and fear. Pride because her son had uncovered something profound. Fear because she knew the Monteros would never allow such a past to resurface so easily. Meanwhile, in the hall, Eduardo's watchful eyes scanned the room, and his expression hardened when he noticed Isabel and Maria's absence. He knew any deviation could be dangerous. Bittencourt, with his hawk-like gaze, also noticed the silent movement of the two women. From a distance, he made a mental note. Isabel would have to be watched from that moment on. Yet Maria, though shaken by the lawyer's earlier threat, found strength in Isabel's revelation. If the foundation's motto was tied to that sign, then perhaps more evidence was hidden somewhere. And with that hope came a chilling fear. If Gabriel had awakened such a powerful memory, what else might be buried beneath the Montero's luxurious facade? The morning after the event, the Montero mansion no longer carried the atmosphere of celebration, but of veiled tension. The newspapers highlighted only the smiling faces and toasts of the previous night, but those who had been there knew something strange had happened. As Maria organized the pantry with other staff, she overheard whispers about Gabriel's gesture. Some employees murmured that the boy had awakened a ghost from the family's past. The thought made her shiver. If even the servants' quarters were buzzing, it meant the repercussion was already slipping out of control. Shortly after, Isabel rushed into the small laundry room where Maria was sorting piles of clothes. Her face was grave, her voice almost a whisper. "The files are gone." Maria's eyes widened. Isabel explained that the old foundation videos, where records of that gesture could once be found, had vanished from the digital systems. It wasn't a technical failure. Someone had deliberately erased everything. Maria felt the ground fall away beneath her feet. If they were trying to erase the evidence, it meant it posed a real threat. And if the Monteros were willing to rewrite history, nothing would stop them from destroying anyone who dared to challenge them. Across town, in a glass-walled office, Eduardo and Dr. Bittencourt met in secret. On the mahogany table lay stacks of documents and a list of names. Among them, Maria Carter and Gabriel Carter. Eduardo, restless, tapped his fingers against the wood while the lawyer maintained the composure of a man executing a calculated plan. "If that boy says more than he should, we could both lose everything," the heir said, his voice hard. Bittencourt, with a faint smile, replied, "I've already started eliminating any trace of the past. Now we need to control the people." The words lingered in the air like a sentence. Meanwhile, Maria and Gabriel remained unaware they were at the center of a conspiracy spreading like a shadow, ready to consume every step they took. 2 days later, the Montero Foundation hosted a charity luncheon in its grand auditorium, filled with distinguished guests, journalists, and representatives of partner companies. The mood seemed light on the surface, but Gabriel felt the weight of countless stares each time he passed between the tables, helping his mother serve. Maria tried to mask her anxiety, but her heart told her something would happen that day. Helena was present, silent as always, but her eyes followed the boy's every move, as if seeking in him the only true connection in the crowded room. At the height of the event, as toasts rang out and cameras turned toward the stage, one of the foundation's oldest donors, a corpulent man with a face flushed from too much wine, suddenly stood and pointed at Gabriel. His voice thundered through the hall. "That boy is manipulating Mrs. Helena. Everyone saw what happened at the party. He's making up signs to take advantage of her weakness." The auditorium plunged into heavy silence. Journalists quickly adjusted their cameras, smelling scandal. Eduardo crossed his arms with a cynical smile, pleased with the unexpected accusation that played in his favor. Maria, pale, felt her vision blur, but she couldn't react. Gabriel, however, stepped forward. His heart pounded, but his eyes held steady. Helena raised her trembling hand and began to sign, and the boy, without hesitation, translated in a clear voice. "She says she doesn't need anyone to speak for her. She still has a voice, even in silence." A murmur rippled through the hall. Some guests looked away in embarrassment, while others clapped discreetly. Helena touched the boy's shoulder in gratitude, confirming each word. Eduardo, meanwhile, clenched his fist in contained rage. The moment that should have silenced Gabriel had only made him more visible. And suddenly, everyone realized that this boy had more power than anyone dared to admit. The murmur in the auditorium still echoed when Helena, for the first time in years, rose with effort from the chair where she had long remained forgotten. The sound of her cane striking the wooden floor resounded through the hall like unexpected thunder. The audience, startled, immediately fell silent. Every gaze turned to the silver-haired woman, who now seemed more imposing than all the millionaires seated around her. Even without a voice, Helena radiated a strength capable of silencing an entire room. Her eyes glistened with restrained tears, but also with the resolve of someone who would no longer accept being ignored. With slow but steady movements, Helena raised her hands and began to sign before everyone. Gabriel, standing beside her, felt his heart race as he translated in a firm voice so every person in the auditorium could hear. Transparency is the only legacy worth leaving. The words rang out like a verdict. Some guests applauded with conviction, while others exchanged uneasy glances, fearing this was only the beginning of something greater. Maria wept quietly, clutching a dish towel to her chest, overcome with pride as she watched her son give voice to the matriarch. Isabel, moved, clasped her hands tightly in her lap, silently affirming that this was proof the truth was still alive. Eduardo, however, did not move. His face hardened, and he clenched his teeth at the scene. To him, watching his own mother give a stage to a maid's son was intolerable. Bittencourt, seated only a few feet away, leaned discreetly toward Eduardo and murmured something only he could hear. The heir then smiled, not with relief, but with calculation. If the matriarch was willing to resurrect old ideals, he was prepared to use old and cruel methods to silence any threat. Helena had risen not just physically, but against years of imposed silence. What no one knew was that, in that very moment, Eduardo and Bittencourt were already planning their next move. The silence still gripping the auditorium was broken by the measured sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. Dr. Bittencourt rose from his seat, adjusted his glasses with the tip of his fingers, and, with the calm of someone who had planned everything, walked to the stage. His voice, always low but sharp as a blade, echoed through the microphones. Interesting to hear so much about transparency, but perhaps we should look more closely at who is bringing us these words. He opened a black leather folder tucked under his arm and carefully unfolded a set of documents. The hall sank into tension. Fixing his cold gaze on Maria, the lawyer held the papers high for all to see. Here are official records showing that this woman, Maria Carter, was investigated years ago for theft of property from an office building. This is the mother of the boy who now dares to present himself as an interpreter of truth. Should we really trust someone with such a past? Murmurs slashed through the air like knives. Some guests lowered their eyes, others frowned, but all were shaken. Maria felt the ground vanish beneath her. Her legs trembled, her body turned cold, and the tray in her hand slipped, scattering glasses and plates across the floor. Gabriel rushed to his mother's side, grasping her arm, but his voice faltered as he tried to defend her. Maria's tearful eyes begged for understanding, but the atmosphere in the auditorium was one of relentless judgment. Helena glared at Bittencourt with indignation, but her signs were not translated. No one gave her space. Isabel, however, clenched her fists beneath the table. She knew this was nothing but a trick, a calculated manipulation designed to destroy Maria and silence Gabriel. Even so, the impact was devastating. Faced with so many seemingly official documents, who would believe mere words without evidence? The weight of slander spread through the hall like poisonous smoke, leaving everyone in doubt. As the murmurs grew louder, Isabel slowly rose to her feet, her eyes locked on Bittencourt. Her elegant posture contrasted with the unshakable determination now radiating from her every movement. Holding a tablet in her hands, she walked toward the center, her voice clear and serene, yet charged with conviction. These documents the doctor presented are nothing but distortions. I have here the digital records of the company where Maria worked during that same period. She was registered at another location, fulfilling her shifts in full. Every clock in and clock out was recorded electronically. The audience, which moments earlier had leaned against Maria, now split into divided glances. Some leaned closer, trying to glimpse the glowing screens Isabel projected. Bittencourt remained still, his cold smile unshaken. Digital, he repeated with disdain. Any street hacker could forge that. His remark was followed by an uncomfortable silence, quickly sharpened by a crueler blow. Curiously, all the building's cameras disappeared from the records that same week. Coincidence? I'd call it convenience. The whispers surged back with force. Journalists scribbled feverishly, and the guests, divided, no longer knew whom to believe. Maria, still pale, clutched Gabriel's hand, which held hers tightly, trying to give her a confidence he did not feel himself. Isabel, however, did not back down. She lifted her chin and declared in a firm voice, "If there are gaps, it's because someone created them. Someone powerful enough to erase physical evidence, but not clever enough to realize traces always remain." The hall hung suspended for a few seconds, as though waiting for the next move in a chess match. From her table, Helena raised her hands and signed, demanding Gabriel to translate. The truth cannot be erased. Sooner or later, it finds the light. When the boy repeated it aloud, he drew a mixture of applause and murmurs of indignation. Eduardo, seated at the main table, gripped his crystal glass so tightly it nearly shattered. It was clear that, even at a disadvantage, Maria was not alone, and that made everything even more dangerous. That same night, after the auditorium had emptied and the tension still hung in the air like smoke, Isabel led Maria and Gabriel down little-used corridors of the Montero Foundation. The air was cold, the silence heavy, every step echoing against the high, wood-paneled walls. At the end of the hallway stood an iron door, usually locked. Isabel pulled a set of old keys from her pocket and, with steady hands, unlocked the entrance. This was the founder's private office. "No one has entered here in years," she whispered. Gabriel, heart racing, helped push open the heavy door, which creaked to reveal a room cloaked in dust and mystery. The shelves were packed with leather folders, boxes of documents, and contracts stamped with the family's golden crest. Maria, still shaken, hesitated to step in, but Gabriel walked straight to the central desk. There, among the yellowed papers, he found something that caught his eye: two different versions of the same contract. One carried the original clause, absolute transparency in all foundation negotiations, while the other contained subtle changes, replacing the words with vague and malleable terms. Isabel leaned in, examining the pages with indignation. These changes weren't made by the patriarch. They're recent, and signed under Eduardo's supervision. The shock made Maria bring her hands to her mouth. It explained everything. Eduardo had been manipulating his father's legacy, rewriting contracts to conceal financial schemes. Before they could discuss what to do, heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor. The door burst open, slamming against the wall, and Eduardo stormed in, his eyes blazing with rage. Behind him, Dr. Bittencourt stood silently, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. "What do you think you're doing?" Eduardo barked, advancing several steps. Gabriel instinctively clutched the papers to his chest, but he knew that gesture could cost him dearly. In that moment, the discovery that could save his mother also became the reason why they both faced the greatest danger of their lives. The air inside the old office grew suffocating. Eduardo advanced, his face consumed by fury, the gleam of the chandeliers reflecting in his eyes like blades ready to cut. Maria shielded Gabriel with her body, but the boy, resolute, raised the tampered contract for all to see. "It's here," he shouted, his voice trembling yet firm. "This is not the patriarch's will, it's a lie." Isabel confirmed aloud, her voice ringing as she faced Eduardo directly. "You erased the very essence of the foundation to feed your own power. The motto of transparency was destroyed by your hands." The echo of the accusation reverberated against the walls, leaving no room for retreat. Eduardo laughed with disdain, trying to twist the situation to his favor. "You people know nothing about business. I kept this empire standing while all of you lived in illusions. Transparency doesn't pay bills, it doesn't sustain an inheritance." But before he could continue, a sharp sound cut through the air, Helena's cane striking firmly against the floor. The matriarch had entered quietly, but now she rose like a sentinel against her own son. Her eyes blazed with indignation, and her hands, in clear gestures, signed a sentence that Gabriel translated aloud. "Without integrity, there is no legacy." The phrase fell like thunder, drawing spontaneous applause from some who watched from a distance. Eduardo felt the ground shake beneath him. For the first time, there was no argument strong enough to erase the truth echoing before everyone. Bittencourt, sensing the tide turn, quietly stepped back, like a man abandoning a sinking ship. Isabel gathered the original contracts and raised them before the approaching guests, showing the undeniable proof of fraud. Maria, overcome with emotion, embraced Gabriel, who was still trembling but remained firm. And Eduardo, once so imposing, now seemed nothing more than a cornered man, exposed by his own past. Yet even in humiliation, the fire in his eyes revealed he had not given up, and perhaps still had strength for one last move. A few weeks later, the Montero Foundation reopened its auditorium for a historic event. This time, it wasn't only millionaires and politicians in the front rows, but also students, workers, and representatives of social organizations. The stage was decorated with banners bearing a simple and powerful phrase: transparency above all. The atmosphere was no longer one of ostentation, but of genuine expectation. Helena entered, leaning on her cane, her steps slow but steady, and was greeted with warm applause. At her side walked Gabriel, now recognized not as the maid's son, but as the boy who had given voice to a forgotten symbol. When silence returned, Helena raised her hands and, with firm gestures, repeated the sign she had kept for so many years. Gabriel, moved, translated in a clear voice, "Integrity is the only legacy worth leaving." The audience erupted in applause. Maria, seated in the first row, wept with pride, while Isabel, beside the stage, announced that all falsified contracts had been annulled and that the foundation would henceforth be subject to public audits. The decision marked the rebirth of the institution, now aligned with the original spirit of the patriarch. Cameras captured every moment, and on social media the gesture went viral, transforming Gabriel into a symbol of courage and truth. At the back of the auditorium, Eduardo watched in silence, defeated. The arrogance he once carried had dissolved into a heavy expression, weighed down by the burden of wrong choices. Bittencourt, absent, had already vanished from the stage like a shadow slipping into the dark. Helena, however, did not look back. Her eyes were fixed on the future that had just been born. Gabriel, still nervous, repeated the gesture before the audience, and in that instant everyone rose, echoing in unison the sign that had become a symbol of hope. The camera captured Helena's discreet smile and Maria's tears, and as the applause thundered through the auditorium, one certainty spread: The gesture of a humble boy had forever changed the fate of a millionaire family, and perhaps of many others who believed in the power of truth. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel now, leave your like, and share this video so that more people may discover that even the smallest act of courage can change the world. Write in the comments, "I believe in the power of courage." Together, let's spread stories that transform lives and prove that hope can rise from the most unexpected voices. Thank you so much for your support.